Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Meet a Scientist Tuesday series. Today, just like every Thursday, we are going to be introducing you to a great scientist where you are going to get the chance to learn about what they do and how they became interested in the sciences. Today, we have a special guest, Dr. Mark Stanback from Davidson College, who's going to tell us all about some of his great research on birds. As we go through the presentation, you will be able to comment questions for Mark on the right side of the comments section. And at the end of his presentation, Mark will go through and answer all of your questions about his research, as well as how he became interested in doing the research that he does. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Mark here, who's going to share his presentation with us. All right, Mark, can you hear me here?
I can hear her.
Great, Mark, you are all set. If you want to introduce yourself and pull up your presentation, that'll be great. Perfect.
Okay.
Hopefully
my presentation is up now. Is that correct?
That looks great. You're ready to go.
All right. My name is Mark Stanback. I'm in the biology department. Hi, my name is Mark Stanback. I'm a biology professor at Davidson College in North Carolina. And I'm excited to be here with Headwaters today, partly because the executive director of Headwaters, Meg Seifert, was a student of mine back when she was in college. And in fact, she worked on some of the birds that I'll be talking about today. When people describe me and my research, some people would say that I'm an ecologist. Other people might say evolutionary biologist, or say that I study animal behavior, or that I'm an ornithologist. And in fact, all of them would be correct. I guess if I had to describe myself, I would say I'm an avian behavioral ecologist. And behavioral ecology is sort of the intersection between evolutionary biology, ecology, and animal behavior. And birds are my very favorite study organism. So I do most of my research using birds. And in particular, I tend to use cavity nesting birds. Cavity nesting birds are simply birds that build nests in tree holes. And one reason I like cavity nesters is because these kind of birds are often willing to use nest boxes, and that means I have access to their nest, to their babies, to their eggs, and I can collect data on their reproductive biology. My students and I monitor about 600 nest boxes here in the Davidson area. We're primarily working with eastern bluebirds and tree swallows, but we've also done work with Carolina chickadees, brown-headed nuthatches, purple martins, house wrens, eastern screech owls, and a variety of things. Now, the bird you see in the picture here is not from North Carolina. This is a southern yellow-billed hornbill from Africa, and I recently got back from Namibia, where I've been studying yellow-billed hornbills and several other species of hornbills, looking at their reproductive biology. Now, hornbills are particularly weird because they have a very unusual nesting habit where the female seals herself inside her tree hole using primarily mud, but also poop. And then she leaves a little slit there, and the male can feed her through that slit because she's stuck in there for over 2 months. She also poops out that slit. But while she's in there, she lays her eggs, and as soon as she's done laying, she loses all her wing and tail feathers, and then spends the rest of the time regrowing those feathers, but also incubating her eggs and raising her chicks. And when she's about half grown, she pecks through that plug, squeezes out, and then the chicks close it up behind her, and they're in there for another month or so. Now, as I say, I like cavity nesters and I like nest boxes. And so if I'm studying hornbills, it would be a huge pain to try to study them in natural tree holes. But I've built nest boxes so I can just take the little door off the side of the box and reach in and have access to the female and her chicks. So here is a female red-billed hornbill in the nest with her chicks. She's actually going to be leaving the nest before too long. But this demonstrates one unusual fact about hornbills is that the females start incubating the eggs as soon as she lays her first one. Most birds wait until all the eggs are laid and then they start incubating. But because females start with the first one, the biggest chick is like 3 days older than the next biggest chick, which is 3 days older than the next biggest chick, because it typically takes them about 3 days to produce each egg. So in this photo, you can see the very largest chick right next to the female, and then there's that little tiny pink blob out to the side, which is the youngest chick. And so this is one of the things I'm studying in hornbills about the consequences of this extreme hatching asynchrony and what it means for their reproductive success. But that's not what I'm going to be talking to you about today. Today, I'm going to discuss a project I did with my students a few years back. Can pairing nest boxes reduce nest site competition? So as I said, I study cavity nesting birds. And cavity nesting birds are typically out looking for tree holes to nest in. But there are not tons and tons of tree holes available. So there's a lot of competition for the cavities that are out there. And this competition is not only within a particular species, like eastern bluebirds, but also other species as well. So there are a number of different species here in the Davidson area that make use of tree holes. That includes eastern bluebirds, and then the smaller Carolina chickadee and brown-headed nuthatch. Now, as I started studying these cavity nesting birds, one thing I noticed is that eastern bluebirds were able to dominate nest boxes. That is, if you put out a dozen nest boxes across a big hayfield, you'll probably end up getting a dozen bluebird nests, that they're able to outcompete those smaller species like nuthatches and chickadees for a spot in a box. So people who are interested in trying to maximize the number of birds in an area, they think, well, we need to do something to lessen the competition to allow for coexistence of species. And people who work with tree swallows in bluebirds have found that pairing boxes is a very effective way to do that. Now, for bluebirds, they seem to be bullying the chickadees and nuthatches. But in the case of tree swallows, it's the tree swallows that are the bullies. So people realize that if they put up a pair of nest boxes, like you can see in the image here, that the tree swallow will settle in one, so it'll be a male and a female raising their family, but they will prevent another pair of tree swallows from moving in right next door because they are intolerant of one another. However, that means that second box is available to bluebirds. So by putting up pairs of boxes, you can allow for the peaceful coexistence of two species that might otherwise compete. So I wanted to know whether this strategy might work with bluebirds and these smaller species like brown-headed nuthatches and Carolina chickadees. And I was particularly interested in brown-headed nuthatches because this species is somewhat threatened. It's been on the decline for 50 years. So this is a bird that's found only in the southeastern United States. It's closely related to the pygmy nuthatch, which is found out west. But brown-headed nuthatches are not doing great, and a lot of people are concerned about what we can do to help them maintain their populations in the 21st century. And so one thing I've noticed is that brown-headed nuthatches seem not to fare particularly well when competing for a nest box with the bluebird. So my big question was, can we use paired boxes to see if that will allow for coexistence of bluebirds and brown-headed nuthatches, and also Carolina chickadees, in the same way that paired boxes promote coexistence between tree swallows and bluebirds. Well, to find out whether this strategy would work, we needed to do an experiment. And so what we did was set out pairs of boxes, and we standardized the distance between boxes. So within a pair, the boxes were 10 meters apart. And the closest pairs were like 200 meters from one another. Now, the pairs of boxes were of two different kinds. We had boxes where both boxes were identical and had identical, I call big holes. So this is a hole that's 1.5 inches in diameter, 38 millimeters, and it accommodates bluebirds as well as nuthatches and chickadees. But we also had other box pairs that we call big-small pairs. And a big-small pair is one box has 1.5 inches hole, and the other box has a 1-inch hole. So here you can see the kind of boxes we're using in the two different hole sizes. So the big hole box can accommodate a bluebird, a chickadee, or a nuthatch. The small hole boxes, though, exclude bluebirds. Chickadees and nuthatches are happy to use them, but bluebirds simply can't fit. So to find out whether pairing boxes is a viable strategy to promote coexistence, we had to come up with some hypotheses for what we might see from our data. And one of our scenarios is what I'll call the live and let live scenario. So the idea here is that a bluebird, it wants to use a nest box. It needs 1.5 inch hole. And once it has a box and says, okay, this is my home, it doesn't really care about who the next door neighbor is. If some chickadees want to move in next door, I don't care. I have my house. And so under this scenario, you would expect chickadees and nuthatches to do fine in any box pair, because the bluebird, once they're settled, they don't care what's going on next door. So you would expect to find chickadees and nuthatches in both big pairs and in big small pairs. But there's another scenario, and I'm calling this the interspecific aggression scenario. So interspecific just means between species. And it's been found that a lot of cavity nesting birds, because they have to compete so much for cavities, they do not like other cavity nesters nesting nearby. So under the interspecific aggression scenario, the bluebird gets its box, but then it says, I don't like any other cavity nesters as neighbors. And so regardless of the hole size, I'm going to drive away any chickadee or nuthatch that comes close to my nest. And so under this scenario, you would expect that bluebirds would dominate the entire box pair and be the only birds nesting there. And the other box would just sit vacant because the bluebirds would drive away the birds, regardless of the size of the hole. So that's two of our scenarios. There's a third scenario that I'm calling the greedy bluebird scenario. And the idea here is that a bluebird is going to defend the box that it wants to nest in, but in fact, it will defend any box that it can fit in, because a male bluebird starts guarding the nest box before breeding season starts. And if he's thinking, okay, here are these two boxes and I can fit in both of them, I might as well give my mate a choice of boxes to choose from. So I'm going to defend both boxes and keep away those chickadees and nuthatches if both boxes have 1.5 inch holes, if they're a big pair. If it's a big small pair, the bluebird can't fit in it. So as far as it's concerned, it's a useless box. So it's only going to defend the box that it fits in. So under the greedy bluebird scenario, it will defend two boxes if they both have big holes, but it will only defend one box if the other box has a small hole. So those are our three hypotheses. And so we went out, we collected data, we set up these pairs, we just observed where the birds settled, and here's what our data look like. All right, so big refers to pairs of boxes where both boxes have 1.5 inch holes. Big small refers to a pair of box where one box has the big hole and one box has the small hole. On the y-axis of this figure is the proportion of available boxes occupied. And so what you can see here is the dark bar represents a box pair where only a single bluebird is nesting. So the only bird nesting at this box pair is a bluebird. And we see under the big situation, 80% of box pairs only had a bluebird nesting in it. Very few did the bluebird allow another species to nest there. In the big small box pairs, we see a very different situation. With big small box pairs, and this is data for chickadees, in most of those pairs, in 70% of the pairs, you had a bluebird and a chickadee coexisting peacefully. But that's only if it's a big small pair. And so looking at this, so we had a total of 114 big pairs, a total of 60 big small pairs, and we can do statistics on this distribution of data and say, is this difference statistically different? And the fact our critical p-value is 0.05. And because our p-value here is much less than 0.05, it's in fact less than 0.001, this says that the difference between occupancy of big pairs and big small pairs is highly significantly different, meaning that bluebirds are guarding both boxes in big pairs, but they're willing to let other birds use small hole boxes at big small pairs. Here is the same information, but instead of bluebirds and chickadees, this is bluebirds and brown-headed nuthatches. Once again, we see that in big pairs, bluebirds are guarding both boxes and preventing 90+% of the nuthatches from nesting in those boxes. Whereas at a big small pair, the bluebird has its own box, the other box it can't fit in, it doesn't care who uses it, and so therefore the nuthatches are able to move in. Once again, we see this difference in the bar heights is highly significantly different, suggesting that bluebirds are greedy, that if you give them two big hole boxes, they're going to try to defend both of them. And well, what does this mean for a wildlife manager or someone who's trying to help, coexistence among competing species? Well, these results suggest that we can't use box pairing like we did with tree swallows and bluebirds. It simply does not work with bluebirds and these smaller cavity nesters. So pairing standard boxes does not promote coexistence. If the boxes have the same size hole, the greedy bluebird is just going to guard both of them. So what does this mean for the brown-headed nuthatch? Well, it says that, again, pairing nest boxes is not going to be a quick fix to competition with bluebirds. And in fact, as I said, brown-headed nuthatches have been declining and they're not doing well. And really, a lot of people are concerned about what we can do to help them maintain their numbers. I mean, historically, brown-headed nuthatches, their favorite happy place is a mature longleaf pine forest in the southeastern United States. Unfortunately, we're really good at cutting those down and building housing developments and shopping malls and golf courses. And so the nuthatches have lost a lot of their pristine habitat. The other issue is that the southeast United States, like a lot of places in the country, is very popular for people. And so we're losing a lot of habitat that's getting turned into suburbia. So this map shows in red places with dense housing development. And you can see this entire region, which is the home of the brown-headed nuthatch. This is a projection for 10 years from now, but they're going to be having to deal with lots and lots of suburban habitat. And along with that suburban habitat, they're having to deal with lots and lots of bluebirds. So a lot of people are concerned about eastern bluebirds, but the fact is they're doing great. Here we can see that bluebird numbers over the last half century have, quadrupled or more. whereas brown-headed nuthatches have been declining. And so anything we can do to help brown-headed nuthatches deal with their disappearing habitat and this competition with bluebirds is going to be a very useful thing. So that's sort of bad news for the nuthatches. However, there's good news in that if we provide nuthatches with nest boxes that can exclude bluebirds, they can do really particularly well. I mean, I found that I can increase the brown-headed nuthatch density in an area substantially simply by putting up some nest boxes that have bluebird-proof holes. Now, another thing I've found is that a lot of people, when they think about nest boxes, they sort of equate bluebird box with nest box. And so it's very easy. The standard nest box that you buy at the store typically has a 1.5-inch hole that accommodates bluebirds and lots of other birds. But if you're trying to help nuthatches or chickadees, you're going to have to do something with that box to make it bluebird proof. And you can go to a wild bird store, or you can make your own out of wood, a excluder, a portal protector that can turn a bluebird box into a nuthatch box simply by making a smaller hole. So you can buy a metal plate with a 1-inch hole in it, drill it on the front of a bluebird box, and poof, you now have a brown-headed nuthatch box. Of course, I've also found that it's necessary to educate people, that lots of people love bluebirds and they put out nest boxes for bluebirds. And they think that any nest box should be a bluebird box. So this is one of my brown-headed nuthatch boxes. I put a portal protector on there just to keep the woodpeckers and squirrels from chewing on the hole. But that's a 1-inch hole on this box. And a bluebirder came by and said, FYI, you need a bigger hole on this box because it won't fit a bluebird. And obviously, the only people who want to put up bird boxes should be putting them up for bluebirds, which is just not the case. And so I've been having to educate people that putting up nest boxes with smaller holes on there is part of a good plan to diversify the birds in an area, that we don't just want a monocrop of eastern bluebirds. Now, before I take your questions about bluebirds and nuthatches and chickadees, or about hornbills, I'm going to very briefly talk about some of the projects that I'm doing this year in 2020. First one is about bluebirds and cowbirds. And the question is, well, why do cowbirds wait until the host has an egg before laying their own? And I should explain here, a cowbird, which you see down in the bottom photo, these are birds known as brood parasites. They lay their eggs in other birds' nests. So they don't even know how to build a nest. They don't even know how to feed a baby. The female just dumps her eggs in other birds' nests and leaves them to take care of them. Now, of course, the other birds often don't like raising cowbirds, and so they'll throw the eggs out. But cowbirds seem to always wait until the host has at least one egg before they start laying. And I was curious as to, well, first of all, it makes sense why a cowbird wouldn't wait until all the host eggs are laid and they're halfway through incubation, because if they lay an egg in, then the cowbird chick will hatch too late and it'll starve to death. So I wanted to know, is there a penalty for cowbirds who lay their egg too early? What happens to cowbird eggs that get laid in nest before the host starts laying? One idea is the host sort of goes to the nest and says, oh, I didn't lay an egg today. This egg is not mine. I'm going to throw it out. Whereas if the host is already laying, it can say, oh gosh, which egg is which? I'm kind of confused here. And so I'm doing a project where I go around to my bluebird boxes, and if I find a complete but empty bluebird nest, I can add a fake cowbird egg to it. So basically I have little wooden eggs. They're the same size as cowbird eggs. I spray paint them to look like cowbird eggs, and I can stick them in bluebird box. But I can also find empty bluebird nest and not put a cowbird egg in there. So I can look at the ejection rate of cowbird eggs from nest with 0 bluebird eggs versus nest with 1 bluebird egg, because I have that data from past years. But I can also see if the presence of the cowbird egg freaks the bluebird out and makes it delay its nesting itself. And so if it does that, that could be a penalty for the cowbird. So that is one of my experiments. I simply walk around to my hundreds of nest boxes, and if I encounter an empty bluebird nest, I can either put a fake cowbird egg in there or not. Another experiment I'm doing this year, and I say I'm doing it, I usually do my experiments with my students, but because of coronavirus, Davidson College has no students, so I'm here by myself. And even though I'm sitting in my house right now, a lot of my boxes are out in hay fields, etc., that I can visit. And so I'm by myself, I'm outdoors, I can do these projects and not endanger myself or anyone else. But this next project has to do not with cowbirds, but nest predation. A paper came out a year ago showing that if a female bird finds itself in a place where her nest is likely to be discovered by predators, she can sort of say, oh gosh, I didn't realize there were going to be predators here. I'm going to lay fewer eggs. I'm going to not put all my eggs in one basket. That if there's a high probability that my nest will get eaten, I'm just going to not lay as many eggs. I'm not going to put in that effort. And so I wanted to know if it's true for bluebirds. And so as I walk around, if I encounter a nest that has a single fresh bluebird egg in it, I can either wrap a rubber snake around it for 10 minutes or put a rock on top of it for 10 minutes. And so this 10 minutes exposure to a predator should make the female think, oh gosh, there's a big mean snake that lives here and it's very likely to come and eat my eggs or babies. I think I need to lay fewer eggs. The rock is my control, because when you do an experiment, you want to make sure you're controlling for everything except the thing of interest. And so the rubber snake is the thing of interest, but I need to control for the fact that I'm walking up to this box 2 different times, that I'm sitting 70 meters away for 10 minutes watching it. And so I need to control for those things, but I want a non-threatening item I can stick on the box instead of the snake. So I can compare how many eggs females lay if they got a snake versus if they got the rock treatment. And if they lay fewer eggs with the snake treatment, I'll be able to conclude that bluebirds can assess the relative threat to their nest and then reduce. Generally, about 2/3 of females will throw out a cowbird egg, whereas 1/3 of females will accept the cowbird egg and incubate it. So I'm curious about, well, what cues are females using to determine whether or not to toss out a cowbird egg? And one of those cues could be visual, the color of it. And so I wanted to be able to put in 2 different items that differed in color, but they were both obviously not eggs. So they had the wrong texture. And so if I find a bluebird nest that has 2 or 3 fresh eggs in it, I'll add either an orange or a blue foam earplug. And if females are using texture as their cue, a tactile cue, we should see them ejecting all earplugs, regardless of color. However, if color is an important thing, if they see blue as meaning bluebird egg, we could see females ejecting fewer blue earplugs than orange earplugs. And so, again, by just visiting the nest, if it has 2 or 3 eggs, I put in an earplug, then I'll return a week later because I check all my boxes once a week. If the earplug is gone, if the earplug is there, I can just record that data. But this will allow me to tell whether females are using visual or tactile cues to determine whether or not to throw something out. And my last project here is, again, having to do with cowbird eggs and having to do with the cues that they're using. But there was a paper that came out 2 years ago showing that the position that the cowbird left its egg in influences the probability that the host will toss out the egg. And so basically, I want to compare the ejection rate of fake cowbird eggs put into the center of bluebird eggs versus put on the edge of bluebird eggs. So if I find a nest with 4 to 6 fresh bluebird eggs, I'll add a cowbird egg either in the center or at the periphery. And if she's ejecting these eggs at different rates, that will suggest that the location of parasitic eggs makes a difference, as well as the appearance of those eggs. So those are my projects for this year, and I would be happy to answer any questions about these projects, about the nest site competition experiment, or about hornbills. So let me get out of this mode.
Perfect.
And
thank you so much, Mark. I have a whole host of questions that have come in during your presentation, and we can try and get through a bunch of them. The first question I have for you is, why do bluebirds do so much better than nuthatches in suburban areas?
Good question. I think a lot of it it's just sort of luck. Bluebirds like to forage in open habitat in low grass. And so lawns are lovely low grass areas that bluebirds find it very easy to find food. And I've even found, I do a lot of my work on golf courses, even though golf courses are known for using lots of chemicals, and often fairways don't have a whole lot of bug life on them, any bug on a golf course fairway is really easy for a bluebird to spot and then eat. And so if bluebirds have a place to nest, suburbia ends up being a pretty good place for them.
Great. My second question for you is there a size limit of boxes that cowbirds can fit in, like how we talked about with bluebirds?
A cowbird tends to be pretty much the same size as a bluebird, ever so slightly larger. And so I've seen some cowbird females that can't quite squeeze into a bluebird box. And so that 1.5 inch hole seems to be, certainly if it's smaller than 1.5 inches, a cowbird can't fit, but then neither can a bluebird. So bluebirds are always going to be vulnerable to cowbird parasitism. However, cowbirds much prefer to lay their eggs in birds' nests that are not in cavities. So birds that just have cup nest in a bush or a tree, that tends to be where cowbirds sort of gravitate to. So the actual parasitism rate of natural bluebird nest is much lower than the parasitism rate of a thrush or a cardinal or something like that.
Great. So it sounds like you have a lot of bird boxes that you go out and visit in the spring. Do you have a rough number of how many boxes you might visit or study in a given season?
Well, I have about 600 boxes, and the goal is to check every single box once a week. So I have to check 600 boxes a week. And, some of my boxes, I have them set up in places that mostly tree swallows will be using them. And tree swallows and bluebirds will use the same kind of box. But by putting a box in a certain habitat, I can sort of bias my chances of getting a tree swallow versus a chickadee or a nuthatch. But overall, my students and I stay very busy from mid-March through the end of July.
I have a question here from Charlie in Maryland, who wanted to know if you had any recommendations on types of bird food that might be better for attracting colorful birds.
I would say that, it's definitely true that different types of seed will attract different types of birds. But I would say the single most popular seed for birds is sunflower seed.
Okay.
And sunflower seed without the shells is actually super popular, and birds like bluebirds that don't have beaks that can crack open sunflower seeds. Bluebirds will happily eat shelled sunflower seeds, but they can't do anything with sunflower seeds that have the shell. Often the typical wild bird seed that you can pick up at the hardware store, it contains a lot of seed that not all birds necessarily like. I mean, a lot of juncos and sparrows love the tiny little millet seeds, but the round milo seeds, very few birds enjoy milo. So if I had, in my own personal bird feeders, I stock them only with sunflower seed. And I sometimes throw some millet out for the juncos and the sparrows.
Okay. Our next question is, how did you first become interested in birds, and what was it about them that has led you to study them?
I think I can credit my father with sort of turning me on to to really liking birds a lot. When I was a little kid, for my brother and my sister and myself, he would give us a nickel for every bird we could identify at the bird feeder. And so my brother and sister, they're not ornithologists, but they are non-ornithologists who know their birds. They're pretty good birders. And so he really instilled in all of us this passion for birds. But I think I took that interest and went the farthest with it. And so, again, I like birds a lot. And one thing about doing science is science can be, especially field biology, it can involve, physical discomfort and tedium and boredom. But if you really like your study organism, you're able to put up with a lot of that discomfort and tedium more than if you don't like your study organism. So I think because I like birds so much, I'm willing to deal with heat and humidity and briars and all the other discomforts of field work, because I find them so intuitively interesting. And also, as I've said, and hopefully as I've shown, I run into people, and I'm studying birds out there, checking my boxes, and they ask, "Oh, are they endangered?" Because I think a lot of people think the only reason you would study a bird is if it's endangered. And it's like, well, no, I'm not studying endangered birds, because I see bluebirds basically as guinea pigs, as white mice, lab mice. I can ask scientific questions by using these hundreds of nest boxes. I can get big sample sizes. I can ask very specific questions and design experiments and collect data and answer questions and publish results using an organism that I like a lot, but also because they're not endangered, I can have hundreds of bluebird nests and I can collect great amounts of data. So, I think my interest in birds is partly, personal, but it's also practical. That they're just cavity nesting birds are a great organism to work with. I tried to study mockingbirds when I first came to Davidson, and finding their nest was just so difficult. And if I wanted to study reproductive biology, finding nests is important. So that's why I'm sold on nest boxes.
Great. I have two more questions for you. This next question comes from Leah, and she wanted to know, you talked about how the big and the small bird boxes can increase biodiversity in a region, but I assume that's during the nesting season. Is the biodiversity that you might be able to increase during nesting season with those paired boxes, is that maintained during the rest of the year when the birds aren't nesting?
Good question. And the answer might be a little disappointing because it depends. So in the case of bluebirds, chickadees, and nuthatches here in North Carolina, they are all resident species. And so all the birds who are here in the spring and summer are also here during the winter. The tree swallows that I study here in the Davidson area, they're migratory. So in the wintertime, they disappear. So it really does depend on what species you're talking about. There are other cavity nesters that are migratory. The house wrens, for example, that fill my boxes with sticks and I find very annoying, they do not winter here in Davidson. They're further south, and then every year they come up and they spend the summer here. So it really does depend a lot on the species you're talking about.
Okay, great. And then my last question for you comes back to the very beginning when we were talking about the hornbills, and you showed us a great picture of some of those hornbills that were born without feathers. And we had a question from a couple students who wanted to know, why are birds typically born without feathers, and what might the reasons for that be?
Well, the short answer is that some birds are born with feathers. If you think about, baby chickens and baby ducks, they hatch out and they're covered in fluff and they can run around and feed themselves and be active. But other birds like bluebirds and hornbills come out of the egg as naked pink blobs. They have to be kept warm by their parents. They have to be fed by their parents. They're often, their eyes aren't open. So it's really about, if you're a duck, you need, a duck that nests on the ground can't afford to have its babies be helpless pink blobs in a nest on the ground near a pond. To hit the ground running, get out into the pond, swim from predators. And so different selection pressures have pushed different groups of birds to solve this problem of development and avoiding predation in different ways. And cavity nesting birds, for the most part, I guess wood ducks are cavity nesters, but most cavity nesters actually have more helpless pink blobby chicks than cup nesting birds, because cavity nesters tend to be safer from predators, and so they're in less of a hurry to get out of the nest, and so they can have a slower development. And slower development means that mom and dad are going to take care of you. You don't have to immediately grow a bunch of feathers. You can put your energy into other parts of your body growth, instead of just trying to get out of the nest as quickly as you can. So, there are lots of different sort of solutions to the problem of how is the best way to grow up as a bird. And for many species, for songbirds, that tends to be a pink blob. And for things like chickens and ducks and grouse and quail, it's hatch out and start running.
Perfect. That's a great answer to that question, and some great observations from some of our audience members. Sorry, I had one more question just come in. Do the brown-headed nuthatches die at a higher rate than the bluebirds, or how does the mortality rate between those two, is that different?
Short answer is I don't know. Okay. And I'm not really, to look at lifespan, it would require that I capture and individually identify every single bird, like by putting colored leg bands on with different combinations and doing regular censusing to see when birds disappeared. And I've found that there are plenty of ornithologists that do exactly that kind of study, but I found that at a small college like Davidson, I would rather focus my students on answering research questions that can be easily answered by, putting in fake eggs and visiting a box once a week, because to catch every bird and give it individual colored bands takes an enormous amount of time, and that's time that neither I or my students have. And so I've opted not to do those sorts of studies. Now, do bluebirds and nuthatches have different mortality? Probably somewhat. One interesting thing about nuthatches, brown-headed nuthatches, is they are cooperative breeders. They live in communal family groups. So mom and dad will have kids with them that they raised several years back, just hang out with mom and dad and help them feed babies. And it's been shown for a lot of cooperative breeders that that can increase your survivorship. It can decrease your survival, your mortality rate if you live in a cooperative group. And so that might be coming into play. And in fact, I didn't even get into the competition between nuthatches and chickadees, that group living nuthatches tend to be able to compete better against chickadees than nuthatches that are just a male and a female raising chicks. So it gets complicated, as so many things do.
Well, perfect, Mark. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and what I assume is your field season to tell us all about these really interesting birds and how you study them. We really appreciate it.
Well, I'm happy to help out, and I definitely support, all that Headwaters is doing, getting kids out in nature, asking questions, and devising experiments and collecting data. It's a great thing.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate it. If any of you have questions that we weren't able to get to, you can always leave them in the comment section of this video and we'll get back to them. But thank you, Mark. We will talk to you another time, and good luck with the rest of your research this spring.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.